this isn't healthy. This isn't the right way that any of us should be building businesses. And maybe the age-old wisdom that cash is king, right? Like, in the end, it doesn't matter how much money you're raising. That's a privilege that's interesting. But as a founder, never get yourself into a position where you're losing so much money that you have to fire people to get it working. Activism and entrepreneurship, they're both trying to solve fairly similar problems, but in different ways. They're both very powerful parts of my personality. And maybe I'm still just coping with the fact that I've abandoned this movement, and I'm still trying to justify to myself why. And maybe I'm just hoping that one day, in some way, I will build enough of that leverage to have a shot at this challenge, right, of giving freedom back to Hong Kong people.
Welcome.
Thank you, AJ. Very exciting.
Gonna jump back to probably quite an intense period of the startup journey, which was when you were staring bankruptcy in the face with your previous startup, Mana. Can you talk about what led you to that point of the company almost dying, and then how you got past it?
Yeah, we were trying to build a consumer education company. And we started off with just enormous amounts of optimism, probably over optimism what we should do, right? And so we thought at the time, we could build this AI native tutor for every student. We're going to build this live learning platform on top of that, connect every sort of great instructor in the world to teach you, amazing knowledge. And it turned out we were completely wrong with a couple of big assumptions, right? So one was that, I grew up in Hong Kong, and back there, in China, like, education outside of schooling is a top 5 consumer household spend. And we thought around the world, it's probably around the same amount. And that wasn't true at all in the West, right? So in the West, education spending outside of school is not even a top 10 spend, right? And so it was very, very difficult to convince people to spend any money really outside of core schooling. And then we made a sort of terrible assumption also that people really wanted to learn, right? And most of the time, people just didn't want to learn at all. And even if they really did want to learn, it would have to be, something that deeply interested them and had some kind of economic incentive tied to it. And so we were just completely wrong on those assumptions. And so what happened then was that we raised around £1.5 million in capital at that time. And we'd spent around 2 years building this product, releasing it, getting to around 100,000 users. But we were churning 25% of those users every single month. It was really difficult to keep things up. And so in order to sort of keep the numbers up so we could do a fundraise, we're just spending more and more on ads, right? So we're just like dumping Google ads out, Instagram ads, everything we could do to sort of keep the number up and to the right while the churn was just like increasing as this was happening. And so by around 2 years into the company, we were 2 weeks away from running out of money. And at that point, we were in the middle of a fundraise, and we're talking to every investor you could imagine. And the feedback was just the same, right? If this was going to work, that $1.5 million should have got you there. But you spent $1.5 million. You've bought a bunch of users. None of them are paying, right? And you've got this product that sort of half works. You've got a really big team that really shouldn't be that big. And just none of this makes sense. And so it was a very, very difficult fundraise. And so 2 weeks away from running out, I thought that was it, right? The company was just done. And then suddenly, there was this Portuguese social impact fund called Maze. And there's this managing partner there called Antonio Miguel. And Antonio and I had known each other for around 2 years at that point. And we really, really sort of loved each other in terms of, just having this amazing alignment of vision of like, surely people must be better than this, right? Surely people would want to learn. Surely people would want the best for themselves, so on and so forth. All these sort of very idealistic visions about humanity. And so we loved each other for that reason. And so he was like, hey, our fund no longer has any mandate to invest outside of Portugal. But if you're willing to become a Portuguese subsidiary and really willing to become effectively a Portuguese company, we could put 500K in and we'll save the company. And so within 2 weeks, we basically went off and tried to set up this Portuguese subsidiary, in the space of, 1.5 weeks really to try to do this thing where you have like a UK topco, you have a US subsidiary, you have a Portuguese subsidiary. They invest the money into the Portuguese subsidiary. Then they need to convert the shares into the UK company, like crazy complex legal stuff. And we had Portuguese lawyers, Portuguese bankers, everything. And I thought, all right, how hard could it be to start a company, right? Like, in the UK, it takes a day. And it turned out it was very, very hard. And so we were 2 days away from running out of money when we literally were just waiting for the docs to come in. We were like, God, let's just sign this, let's just wire this. And literally, I could not get a hold of our lawyers, our bankers. Everyone was gone. And so I looked at this and I was like, all right, what is going on? And turns out in this super critical day, it's a holiday in Portugal. And there's like literally nothing we could do. And so in the end, like Antonio personally went off to the bankers and the lawyers to basically get them to do something. And we finally wired at the very, very last minute. And we saved the company. In the end, it was like a massive sort of transitionary period where, you know, I I think in the end, like we pivoted the whole company right after the funding round, right? And so the investors didn't even invest in like the original idea. They were really just betting on the team. Um, but in that moment, the thing I remember the most was our CTO, Nikki, who wasn't a co-founder actually. She was actually just a member of the staff. She came in around 6 months after the company started. Um, and Nikki was like, you do know that we're gonna stay until the ship sinks, right? Like we're gonna be here until the end. And I don't think I'd ever had this sort of really tight relationship with the team before. Not even obviously in any of the sort of corporate environments before. Certainly not even in some of the smaller things I'd built before. And I thought, wow, like these people really put their livelihoods in some way in the trust of the company. And so I was oddly proud, but also terrified at the time. But yeah.
What a story. What do you think caused the team to be so close and dedicated?
I think it was a team that was in many ways very emotionally volatile because of that closeness, actually. So we were close because from day one, as a company, we decided we wanted to be very humane, very friendship focused, not even just sort of work focused. And so, we were a company that started in COVID, right? So we started in November 2020. Um, and so as a result, we had to be remote. And the only way we could build a tight personal relationship was by organizing these quarterly retreats. So essentially, every 3 months, we would get the whole company together. And, at that time, there were around 10 of us. And so we'd go to a foreign location and we would just live together for a week. And we would time these around the most critical moments for the company. So, the first retreat was when we launched our first app, right? And so it was literally, we launched it together at the retreat. We were in this Scottish castle that cost next to nothing at that time because no one was going to Scottish castles in the middle of COVID. And it was this like super cheap Airbnb, but it had two. It was in the middle of nowhere, and it had like two jacuzzis in the back, right? And so we'd have these super deep conversations in the jacuzzi, which is like incredibly sad, like startup style, right? Where we would just be sitting there late at night looking at the stars because there's nothing around this building. And so you just look up and it's pure, like you just see all the stars up there. And we're in this jacuzzi. And one of our team members, like Jake, who was 18 at the time, Jake would just start asking us, what's the greatest failure in your life? You know, what was the most pivotal thing that changed like your view of the world and so on and so forth. And so we have these sort of super deep conversations. And imagine that every quarter we had something like this, and we were in a position where aside from these retreats, in every other aspect of our lives, we were just locked down in our houses. And so really, this team were the only people we were seeing repeatedly and constantly. And so I think that made the team sort of really, really tight on a friendship level. I'm not sure it was a necessarily good thing for the company, right? Because that closeness also meant deep emotional volatility. It meant that every business decision was personal, right? It meant that every pivot, every app decision, every sort of infrastructure decision was deeply important to at least some people on the team. And so as a result, there was constant volatility in the team too because of that. So ups and downsides, but to your question, it probably was the fact that we were started in COVID and built these deep relationships through these retreats.
The thing that doesn't quite connect for me is the deep friendships and the deep personal relationships, meaning that every decision in the company feels personal.
Mm.
Can you just help me connect those dots?
Yeah, yeah. So I think when you're friends with someone, um, you would expect that they would be, yes, honest and transparent with you, but also you would, in a business context, often you make decisions that are at the cost of somebody on the team or some of the work they've done, especially in a startup context. And so you'd have things like, you know, we just built this whole feature because we thought it was a good idea. We launched it to users. It was terrible. We're going to take it out now. Um, Now, for someone who spent a lot of time building that feature, that matters a lot, right? Like it's something they just spent maybe like 3, 4 months of their time on, and now no longer matters. Now, in a business context, if you weren't so personally close to the people making the decisions, it might be like, my boss is a dumb person, or my boss just made a stupid decision. My work just went down the drain. We really should have prioritized better. And there would be frustration, there would be gossip, there would be all these other things that transpire from something like this. But most of the time, that's just sort of a natural part of working life. But if you're really good friends with the person, you then start going, why did you put me through this? Right? Like, why did you make me do all this stuff? Especially when, you probably knew around a month and a half in that, it was not going to work out, but you wanted to test it out. Right. And there are a lot of business decisions where, as a founder, as a CEO, and so on, you're holding a lot of information in your head at once. And you're kind of going, hey, maybe there's a decision that you just can't fully be transparent about. Like, maybe you're talking to your investors about how good the team is, and maybe you have to let go of half the team at some point, right? Because your costs are going too high. Or, maybe this person is like not up to scratch based on what we think is the company's level. But when you're friends, all of these decisions turn into betrayal, like as a result. And so I think it made a lot of decisions very, very difficult. I think what I noticed in the team was that this friendship was very segregable for people who were more experienced. So for people who were, in their mid 30s on the team, they knew how to segregate the business decision from the personal decision very, very well. And so as a result, it was not volatile for them. But we also had very young people on the team, right? So we had, Jake, our head of growth, was 18. We had one of our machine learning engineers was 21, right? And in his first job out of university. And so for these folks, it's like their first experience at work, and they're like, wow, we could be so close, right? We could be friends. We could do all these things together. But then when things, went into a bad cycle, it then became, wow, they aren't really my friends. Like they could make decisions about my livelihood in a way that I can't predict, right? Um, and so, in many ways, in retrospect, I wish I had set much clearer boundaries of what work versus friends really look like, um, and sort of prevented a lot of these sort of very emotional types of conversations that happen down the line when things turn much more difficult.
Before we go into the details of these boundaries, we've dived into it. So, could we pause and give you space to do a quick intro and let the audience know who you are?
Yeah, for sure. So I'm James. I grew up in Hong Kong all the way until I was around 16, 17. I became a pro-democracy student activist in Hong Kong at that time. So we went off on the streets supporting a 13-year-old kid called Joshua Wong to protest against, at that time, national education, which is this patriotic education program that the Chinese government was trying to impose on Hong Kong. And over time, I became more and more passionate about it. So I've been supporting the pro-democracy movement in Hong Kong for a long time. Um, did that, started a charity in Hong Kong that coached students into debating and then eventually into university admissions as well, which I really loved. Then finally came to the UK, studied politics and economics, thought I was going to go back to Hong Kong and be a politician. That was the plan. And then in my second year, the Umbrella Revolution happened in Hong Kong. And at that time, I was leading the student union for LSE Hong Kong students, and also a union of other UK Hong Kong students at the time. And this time we just got completely crushed by the government. And so the question became, do I keep going down in this political route and try to make something out of it? And even then, it was quite clear that most people who were very active were probably going to become martyrs of the system. Um, and it was a noble route. It was probably the more ethically principled route, but it was something that I just could not imagine myself doing. And so I sold out completely and became a McKinsey consultant instead. Right? And so I stayed in London, and I really went to McKinsey thinking I was going to learn how the world worked. Um, and I went to McKinsey, did my classic sort of 2 years there, going across all the consumer vices, right? So I worked in alcohol, tobacco, gambling, private equity. Like you could imagine, like literally all the vices. At some point, someone called me the consumer vices BA, right? So like I was doing everything. Um, and around that time, a senior partner was starting the UK division of a youth employment charity that was funded by McKinsey called Generation. And so they needed someone to help them launch in the UK. So I became part of the founding team here. There were four of us at the time. And we basically coached at risk young people, sometimes homeless young people going through drug abuse, domestic abuse, really challenging situations. And we developed these programs that trained them into nursing assistants in the NHS, cloud operations engineers for AWS, and all that, all those things. And so that charity now still maintains a graduation rate around 80% globally. So it's one of the most effective programs of its kind. I really, really loved it. And then another senior partner at McKinsey moved over to SoftBank in peak SoftBank days in like late 2018. And so he was like, hey, do you want to come over? No idea what Masa wants me to do. But you want to just sort of go do this with me. And so I went there and I was part of the turnarounds team at SoftBank. So my role was mainly to turn around these failing companies in the portfolio. So I was inside WeWork when the IPO was failing in 2019, part of the team that negotiated the deal to get Adam Newman out at the time. Then went into ARM and basically helped them with the ARM NVIDIA merger in 2019 to 2020. And then after that, finally decided I'm going to start my own company. And that was Mana. And we're funded by Global Founders Capital and Goodwater and a bunch of others. And we basically built this consumer education company that tried to create a live learning platform for students. From there, I ended up starting a second company more recently, and we'll talk about why that happened. It's called Ethos, and we're backed by a bunch of investors like General Catalyst. And so that's what I'm building today, which is an AI for investment research company. Yeah. So yeah, that's the arc of my life to date.
Outside of work?
So my dad was a painter, an oil painter. And so I actually learned art from a very young age. And so I've always loved sketching, like, very basic oil painting, nowhere near as good as my dad. But all the sort of art side of things. And I was a musician from a young age as well. So lots of a cappella. And I still occasionally busk on the streets. So that's pretty fun. Yeah,
That's
that's
very fun.
me.
You read in your grandfather's journal,
Hmm.
you have to look downwards at your footsteps as you walk and always walk upwards in your flow.
Hmm.
What does that mean?
Yes, so this was actually my very poor translation of a Chinese journal. And so I try to capture the poetry of what he was saying because it was a very poetic line. But in essence, so first of all, I have a very oddly political family. I was obviously on the pro democracy side of things. But my mother's side of the family are almost all pro China. And my grandfather on my mother's side, who was the person who wrote this journal, he was actually in the Communist Party, right? So he was part of the drafting committee for the Basic Law in Hong Kong, which is is effectively Hong Kong's constitution. And he was representing all of these villagers that he was part of in the new territories in Hong Kong. And on the other end, my dad's family were mostly nationalists. And so they were on the opposite side of the civil war in China. And most of them live in Taiwan because most of the nationalists after the Civil War actually moved to Taiwan. And so in many ways, my family is this microcosm of what happened to China, in the 20th century, because it was both sides of politics. And so in many ways, you would expect that I would then have just completely different views from my mother's family, because obviously they're very pro-China and very much supportive of the Communist Party. And in many ways, I have completely different views from my grandfather, who died when I was around 9. So it's been years. But what I found my grandfather was first we somehow just physically resemble each other a lot. So my mom would send me these like photos of my grandfather, back when he was around 30. and we look almost exactly the same, right? So it's quite terrifying. When I was young, my grandfather, when I was like 5 or 6, he had already had a stroke, so he was mostly bedridden. But he would tell these jokes from the bed, and he was this incredibly lively person. And he would tell these jokes from the bed. He would tell it to the doctors, tell it to everyone, and he would always sort of talk to me in very abstract terms about the need to sort of give back to people. And I think he in many ways sort of defined a lot of the ethos of me as a person, of what I care about. And when I started reading about him really after his death, about what he had done in his life, I realized that this was a person who had dedicated his entire life to entrepreneurship and public service. So he, despite growing up in absolute poverty as a farmer in the New Territories, built one of the first department stores in Hong Kong. Not one of the big ones. So he didn't become a billionaire or anything like that, right? But he built this sort of Chinese department store to import mainland Chinese goods into Hong Kong, so that people could buy, Chinese medicine and Chinese goods and all these types of things like that. And so he was very entrepreneurial. He was exploited a lot by his own family because of how entrepreneurial he was. So he almost got no shares in his own company. Most of his shares were taken by his brother and by other people. And so he didn't make that much money out of it, despite the fact that he was very, very successful in his own right. And of course, he was dedicated to public service, right? So over time, because of the fact that he was representing these villagers and so on, he became the head of the village in the New Territories. And then he eventually came onto the Basic Law Drafting Committee and helped shape the Constitution of Hong Kong. So he had this incredible sense of entrepreneurialism, public service that I just felt like was intuitively part of me. And so I became fascinated by him as a person, despite the fact that I could no longer talk to him and he was, he was long gone. And so my mom would go back every week to clean up this, old house that my grandfather used to live in. So I would sort of follow my mom and go to the house, and we'd just be looking through old drawers and stuff like that. And I found this journal from my grandfather, and it was literally him just writing notes to himself. And this particular line was really about the idea that you can never be distracted by your visions of the future, right? When you're actually working to sort of achieve something, you have to look down at your feet, right? Be, very, very focused step by step on what you have to do right now. But at the same time, you have to have this sense of direction, right? Where are you going? What's the mission? What are you trying to do? And I got the sense that he probably wrote that around the time he was building this department store, because it's incredibly relevant to entrepreneurship. And I read that and I was like, wow. And this is before I was a founder, right? So I was reading this as a teenager, but it stuck with me over time. And as I became a founder, I was like, it finally clicked fully in my head of like, how do you keep that sense of direction, but also your entire focus of everything you're doing is really about these sort of mini steps you're making every day to progress in that direction. So that's the backstory to that journal.
So how do you do that?
So I think a big part of this is um, most of the time visions start top down, right? There are these sort of idealistic assertions about what humanity should have or what humanity should be like. And I think that's always incredibly dangerous, right? Because once you go top down in this way, almost all of these assumptions have a very high probability of being wrong, right? So, the assumptions of how humanity currently behaves, probably wrong. Assumptions about what humanity should have, probably your biased opinion. Assumptions that you should be the person to sort of effect this to humanity, probably some egotistical invention in your head. So almost all of those top-down things are probably going to be wrong. And so, at least in sort of my personal journey so far, I felt like actually it's much, much easier to progressively create a vision from your own problems, right? So to look really deep into yourself and be like, what is the thing that's frustrating me most right now? What are the things that I just wished I had? Literally not anyone else, but just I wished I had. And what would that look like, right? And building from that perspective means that every mini step really is informed purely by your own experience. And in all likelihood, there will be 10,000, 20,000 other people who have a similar type of perspective of what you're trying to do. But that also then develops gradually into a very organic vision about what's possible. Because that vision is not rooted in some idealism top down, but it's rooted in some deep personal experience. And I think one of the most dangerous things, and I've only really begun to realize this very recently, actually, like maybe the last year or so, is that there are a ton of people who start companies very early now. And I'm one of them. Like, I started my first company at 25. There are people starting at 19 and 16. And what happens then is that actually your volume and diversity and sort of surface area of real deep lived experiences, and therefore your library of problems, is very limited. And so that age group is incredibly suited to starting some types of companies. Social media is an obvious example, but also, education might be an interesting one. And also, anything involving sort of social relationships, super interesting. But there's also a lot of things that you don't experience until you've actually had the problem yourself. Um, and and I worry a lot when as a sort of less like as a sort of like very young person, you sort of start going, I'm going to invent all these problems that I could solve, and this is the mission, and this is like humanity, and this is how we're going to change the world. Because actually, most of the time, the people who have changed the world are retrospectively constructing those visions, and making it sound great to us after they've done it.
Before we go deeper into company building,
Hmm.
I'd love to understand what you think the intersection is between this activism that seems very relevant in your family, yourself, and your history,
Hmm.
and then entrepreneurship.
Hmm.
What does the intersection of those two circles look like?
So I think the most obvious one is that both activism and entrepreneurialism are about essentially painting a really powerful vision of the future and mobilizing people, whether in activism's case, it's literally just supporters of the movement, or in the case of entrepreneurship, it's your team, your customers, your investors, mobilizing people to sort of fit into certain parts of that vision to make it a reality. And so in that sense, they're incredibly similar. But in one important sense, they're also completely different, which is that activism most of the time is in opposition to something. Right? So it's saying, hey, I don't like what the government's doing, or I don't like what this institution is doing. And so we should rise up through just sheer force of numbers to force someone powerful to do something. Right? That's often what activism is about. Entrepreneurialism is actually quite different because it says there is this problem that exists out there. It might be caused by a big company, sure. It might be also just an organic problem that humans have that hasn't been solved. And our solution is not to protest. It's not to object to it with sheer force of numbers, but to build something fundamentally new that can actually, take a bet at solving that problem. And I think that's a far more positive way of trying to solve something. And there are many, many classes of problems where I do think that entrepreneurship is actually the much better solution to something like this. So I will take, you know, environmental sustainability as a quick option of this. There's a possibility that protests create the awareness in people's minds. Like activism creates the awareness in people's minds of why it's important to have sustainability. But that may be the sort of end position of that. Like that's it. You get the awareness from people. You may get some people to be more disciplined. But what's truly going to solve this problem is probably a set of technologies that drastically reduces the cost of renewable energy to the point where, everyone will just go towards it because the incentives are aligned. And entrepreneurship really is about identifying these underlying incentive systems and building products that align these incentives towards that goal. Whereas activism often is complaining about the fact that the incentives are currently aligned in this way. And so one of the frustrations I think I still go through every single day, like in my personal life, is so first I feel like I've completely sold out on the activist part of my personality. Right? So I have completely abandoned really most of my friends who are in Hong Kong, who are in jail, in exile, in being constantly tailed by the National Security Office. There are all kinds of people who are being monitored in some meaningful way. And I'm here in complete safety, making money, right? Completely abandoning the cause in some meaningful sense. But at the same time, I've always had the frustration with, especially the sort of Hong Kong democracy movement in general, of like, what are we actually going to do about this? Right? Because we can't just say, we hate the Chinese government. We don't like what they're doing. This is just, this is not democracy. We need to create something when they have all the military, economic, and political power in our city. And really, what the last 10 years have shown us is that there's no power in the numbers in Hong Kong. Right? We can have 2 million out of 7 million people out on the streets, and it doesn't stop the Chinese government from doing what it does. And so, really, the way to solve this problem may well lie in us as a people building our economic leverage, our political leverage as individuals to have a shot at shaping this situation with a voice on the true tables of power. And that means that we can't just be activists. We actually have to be entrepreneurs in some meaningful way. And we have to make our wealth and accumulate our power without any influence of the Chinese government. We can't take any Chinese capital. We can't be tied to Chinese customers. We can't be tied to Chinese political relationships to shape our companies. We need to build it entirely outside their sphere of influence so that we have a shot at shaping some future in the long term. And so in that strange sense, to me, activism and entrepreneurship, they're both trying to solve fairly similar problems, but in different ways. They're both very powerful parts of my personality. And maybe I'm still just coping with the fact that I've abandoned this movement. And I'm still trying to justify to myself why I sort of decided to go on this path. And maybe I'm just hoping that one day, in some way, I will build enough of that leverage to have a shot at this challenge, right? Of giving freedom back to Hong Kong people and having a shot at a brighter future for everyone in that city.
If that narrative of we need to build leverage to actually make change is the justification that you're making for why you're now pursuing entrepreneurship and not activism, that feels legitimate. Which part of you feels like that isn't true?
I think it's that there are no examples of this ever working out. I cannot see a single billionaire, rich person, powerful person who is still authentically motivated by their original mission, who is uncompromised by established interests. When I look down the sort of whatever Bloomberg billionaire index or whatever ranking of billionaires right now, I look at them and just like, most of these are just appalling human beings. Right? And I just disagree with them so fundamentally. And there must be some common reason why these people reach that position while being such horrible human beings. And I think one answer may well be that in order to attain that wealth, in order to attain that power, you just fundamentally have to be self-interested and not driven by some other sort of broader mission. And yes, there are people like, let's say, George Soros, who would fund the Open Foundation and do all these things. You would have, on the other end of the political spectrum, people like Peter Thiel, who are like funding their visions of libertarian ideology. And you could argue that they have held true to their ideology and they're just using their wealth and power to influence the situation. But what I observe most of the time from those situations is just there's this deep alignment of really their self-interest with what they purport to be their sort of wider political mission. And I worry about myself of, hey, I tell myself now that I'm pursuing all this for some broader reason. But that when it really comes down to it, will I have the guts to say, I have one shot at, let's say, I have $30 billion and I'm going to take on the Chinese government. And the result of this is I'm going to get locked up. Right? Will I make that decision? Or will I say, actually, no, having a big house in Miami is awesome. And I have a family now, I have all these people, and I could make much more of a difference doing all these other things and blah, 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 blah. Right? Because to some extent, I've already made the first big sacrifice, first big betrayal of the movement by abandoning it. And so the next big question is going to be, will you abandon it when the sort of big moment comes for us as a people? The final thing I'll say is that on this is that the sort of political hero that I've always had in my head is Lee Kuan Yew, the founding father of Singapore. And what I've really loved about him is that he was able to, in pretty much a third world country at the time, be respected by both the American and Chinese governments. play geopolitics between them and establish this country from nothing and build it up. And really, in the truest sense of the word, he is a political entrepreneur, right? He is someone who built a country from first principles and succeeded in one generation. And that's incredible. But he never had to make the compromise that I made, right? He never went, I'm going to go off and make some money first and then come back and try to do this. He just, studied law, became a barrister, and came back to the country and started building it, right? That's what he did. Um, and in many ways, you could argue maybe I should be doing this in Hong Kong right now, right? Maybe I should be doing what some of my friends are doing, which is they're human rights lawyers in Hong Kong, defending, political prisoners and people who were protesters before. And in so doing, building a deep network in Hong Kong and doing all these things, instead of trying to build this whole complicated political and economic leverage elsewhere. And the only justification I have in my head is that in my generation, there are very few who have the chance to do this and who still have this mission in their heads. And therefore, I must try. But I don't know whether that's really just me coping with the fact that I decided to abandon the movement in the first place.
That's a very real summary. So thank you. Quick pause to talk about Unplugged. Unplugged is the ultimate reset of your mind, body, and soul. It'll challenge you in ways that you didn't expect, and it'll nourish you in ways that you didn't realize you needed. Unplugged is a digital detox cabin experience where you lock your phones and other devices away and reconnect with nature and yourself. I've been a bunch of times. I'm an investor, and I even proposed to my wonderful fiance at an Unplugged. They're magical, they're soulful, they're needed. And if you work your ass off, then you probably need it. So give yourself the respect of a reset. Click on the link in the description below and have a proper switch off. Now back to the episode. We could spend hours talking about that topic specifically, but given that we're focused on relationships and work, I'd love to pivot. Speaking of pivoting, one question that came to mind from when your time at Mana and you pivoted straight after your raise, you said that, and was it Antonio?
Antonio, yeah.
He came on to the company with this similar belief that you had that there should be a change in education. How open were you with him about how the company needed to pivot or was going to pivot?
Yeah. So I think Antonio, from day one, really thought of this as a bet on us as a team. So we were very open to him about the fact that, like, even during the closing of the deal, we were saying to him, we might have to pivot the whole company. We don't know where we're pivoting to at that moment, but we knew we were going to do it. And with Antonio, I think there was a part of it that was disappointing. Right? It was disappointing to me, myself too, where we pivoted into a sales automation company, and it made a ton of money. Right? We went from 0 to around $1 million ARR in around 6 months. Right? So super fast. But it was not at all the original mission, and we found ourselves effectively DMing, basically automating spam. Like that's probably the closest to what the product was actually doing. And most of our clients were these people who were selling, courses that you knew were like probably not very legitimate, right? Where someone's saying, hey, I'm going to teach you how to build software when I haven't built software before, or, I'm going to, teach you how to live a better life. Look at me, the sort of mini Andrew Tates of the world. And really the value of the product was in the fact that we were customizing it so much with a lot of AI native capabilities, right? So we're doing things like, hey, you're pitching to college students, we could scrape, college student society leaders, and then tailor the messages to write like a college student, right? So these were things that weren't really on the market at the time, but now are much more proliferated. And so we're doing all these things, but I'm going, this is not at all any of the mission we had. In fact, it's probably polar opposite to what we were thinking. We were trying to, educate the world and help everyone learn better and help everyone, build better careers as a result. And here we are spamming people about pretty bad products, right? So I constantly felt a deep sense of guilt about that product. And I think for Antonio, it was a bet on the team. But I think there was always a thought at the back of his mind, given that it was a social impact fund too. His fund had an impact mandate tied to the UN SDGs, and they actually evaluated impact metrics every quarter. I think there was always a hope in his mind that given my own mission orientation, that we would bring the company to some mid solution where we would both scale the company and be fully focused on social impact. And one of the not necessarily tough, but maybe very deep conversations that we had in this period after the pivot was basically, was it even possible? Right? Like, was it even possible to build this sort of super social impact oriented company while creating venture scale outcomes? Because, of course, you can make business sustainable outcomes, but can you make venture scale outcomes? Like, is that even possible? And I think we concluded that it is possible in some categories, right? So it's evidently possible in environmental sustainability. Evidently, you can build like energy producers and all kinds of things up and down the stack, like across renewable energy, that could become venture scale companies and replace the entire sort of industrial complex today. Um, Clearly, you can do this in some ways in deep tech, right? But can you do this, in consumer, right? When most of the economic demand comes from really our vices as consumers instead of the best of our human nature. Um, and I think we were very open on that question. I think it was probably trending towards a no. Um, and uh, and so yeah, so I think for Antonio, part of it probably was a bit of a bet on if we had a sort of super mission oriented founder, if we had a bit more capital, we had a great team. Could they find this mythical sort of impact focused venture scale company that's consumer focused on education? And I think the answer probably was no.
So then going back to the fact that he bet on the team,
Hmm.
this is something that it feels like has happened again in this new company.
Mm,
You were sort of scouted in a way
mm,
by Sequoia,
mm,
and they helped you find your now co-founders.
mhm.
Can you speak to that experience of now starting Ethos in this quite unique way?
Yeah, it was very unusual, and I'm still super grateful to Sequoia for what's happened. I mean, so after Mana, basically what happened with Mana was we pivoted the company, we got it to around a million ARR, we took off as a company. Um, but then my dad went bankrupt, midway through 2023. And so the only way I could pay off his bills was to, essentially exit a big portion of my shares, redistribute the rest to my co-founder, and then at the same time go do a bunch of jobs to just pay off my dad's bills. And so I went off and, worked a bunch of jobs, mainly just helping people start funds. Like it's all this sort of classic um, founder trying to figure out what their next thing is type situation. And I was working on these jobs to pay my dad's bills. And I thought at that time, I'm never going to raise venture capital again. Part of it was a position of fear, right? I was like, wow, that I've basically blew 2 million in venture capital to build this failed consumer education company, and now we're doing sales automation, which is the most commoditized product in AI, right? So in many ways, I'm a failed founder, and so no one's going to give me capital. So that part of it was in my head. And the other was I was a bit traumatized by venture capital. Right? So I was like, I don't want this experience where I'm being pressured to build a venture scale outcome at every turn, when actually there are many things that are worthwhile of building that might not have venture scale outcomes, but could be business sustainable. And of course, part of it was also that venture capital limited my freedom a lot, right? So there are lots of things I wanted to do, but when you're building a venture capital funded company, you just have to fully focus on it. And so for that entire 6 to 9 months, I was doing all these jobs. My day was very sort of fragmented. I was doing all these things. And I was in my head going, I might build another company at some point once financials have stabilized, but I don't want to take VC. Right. So I was like, I'm just gonna build it myself. Um, and so then one of my university classmates, George Robson, who's now a partner at Sequoia, um, so we were talking about this sort of idea I had for AI for investment research. And we're talking. He's like, "Hey, you should, meet all these other Sequoia partners, right?" And so we met all these other Sequoia partners from the US and the UK and everyone. And then they were like, "Hey, we love your story. Like, you're a super interesting founder. But really, you should be more ambitious, right? Like, you're building something from a position of fear right now. Like, you are scared because of what happened in your last company. You're scared, both on the level of taking VC, but also on the level of, the level of ambition of your idea, because you're going, hey, you tried this big consumer education thing, it didn't work out. You're doubting all your sort of ideologies or missions, your visions of the future, all that kind of stuff. It's all in your head. And so now you've just gone back to your shell and you're like, I'm just going to build this really safe thing that I know from my McKinsey days, which is like expert networks with AI, right? So they're like, you need to think bigger. And so they're like, okay, why don't you just meet this bunch of people and maybe they'll help you think bigger, right? And so they introduced around 30 people to me. So they were all like super interesting, technical talent, engineering leaders, people who are mostly still in their current jobs in fascinating companies, all the way from DeepMind to Stripe to Play to all these types of places, and very entrepreneurial, but inside companies and thinking about coming out to start a company. And so I met them one by one, and some were personality fits, some weren't personality fits, and had all these conversations. But two people really jumped out at me, and they've now become my co-founders. But at that point, I was like, do I really want co-founders? Like, do I really want to, go raise money again, do all this whole thing? Do I want to drag people into this mess with me? I don't know, right? But to my great surprise, the two of them were just like, look, you know, we don't care whether you raise capital or not. If you want to bootstrap this company and do it together, we will bootstrap with you, right? We've got permission from our family to like go for a year, basically, and just do this, right? And so we could bootstrap with you if you want, right? And so we've gone into these deep, deep, sort of long discussions about the company, what we could do. We're actually doing most of this from Sequoia's office at this point, right? She's just like in their office, in their whiteboards with these like crazy, they have these like, logos of all their portfolio companies sitting in every room, right? So you have like Zoom and Apple, like just like on the wall while you're like drawing up this little chart of your new company. It was completely mesmerizing. And yeah, so eventually we decided we're going to start this company together. And we ended up raising funding for that as well, but it was all because Sequoia you know took the bet of saying, hey, you're an interesting person, we want to help you. um and perhaps the most interesting part of this whole arc is that they didn't end up leading our round, right? They didn't end up putting the first seed check for their company. um, and they basically did all this for free, right? They just basically put us together for that reason. And they're still we're still very close with them, and we're tracking like for the next round and all kind of stuff like that. But um, I do feel like it's a very unique experience with them, where they just build these long term relationships, and they're just shaping these companies and just observing them over time and seeing what they will turn into.
Can you speak to Sequoia's general principle towards relationship building?
I think a big part of it was, and this is just from a founder observing from afar. I don't know how they truly build it inside, um, but I think they start tracking people very very early, right? So both my co-founders, one was from DeepMind and the other was from Google and Meta, and before that NerdWallet. They've both known Sequoia for years, right? So Daniel's known Sequoia since he was at DeepMind, and Sol's known Sequoia since he was at NerdWallet, and these were like 10 years ago, right? Yeah, yeah, and 6 years ago at DeepMind and so on. So very very long term relationships. These are not relationships with an end goal in mind. It is not the case that Sequoia goes and says, you should start a company, or we'll give you money to do this, or we'll do all these things. It was all just this gradual observation of a person, and a gradual observation of them through many interactions like, hey, can you give us a bit of feedback on this person you might have worked with, that we're thinking about right now? Or, hey, what do you think about this topic? Or, hey, have you come across anyone interesting recently that might want to start a company? So very small interactions like this. And also these sort of small events where they would host, where that there'll be like 10 people attending, and you have this sort of intimate lunch with Doug Leone where he cooks you pesto and stuff like that, right? So just absolutely astonishing to do all these things in order to build this gradual observation of the arc of a person, so that when this person, whenever they decide to start a company or join a company, that Sequoia is the first people they talk to, and that Sequoia has visibility over the fact that this is happening. And if we think of venture capital as this gradual funnel where you first just need great deal flow of just visibility of what the great deals happening are, and then from there be very very good at picking, and then from there be very good at winning the deal, and then be very good at supporting that company after you've won the deal. um Really, Sequoia winning from the very very first moment of like that widest part of the funnel of having that visibility of talented people all across the ecosystem. And that's where I think that this whole framework has worked for them.
Feels like a very long term approach as opposed to
Hmm.
uh, VCs thinking in 10-year horizons. You're almost thinking in 15, 20-year horizons, the 5 to 10 years before someone started the company.
Exactly, exactly. And you would never hear a Sequoia partner talk about deal flow or talk about, hey, this is a person we're, looking to, do a deal with or so on and so forth. They do not speak in those terms because they're trying to frame these as sort of long-term human relationships of people they partner with instead of people they invest in as a sort of object entity. That reflects all the way through in their approach, which is interesting.
What's stood out about these two people you out of the 30?
Yeah, for Soul and Daniel. So for Soul, it was like an instant, almost romantic click, right? So you have this um, deep alignment from our backgrounds, where Soul's grew up in the U.S. in Virginia, but his whole family are refugees from Cambodia, right? So he has this deep sort of Asian sentimentality. I don't know even how to call that, but we have all this sort of Southeast Asian sort of fraternal feeling when we first met. All the favorite food, all the favorite things we look at, and so on and so forth. And so very similar. His wife is from Hong Kong. His wife's dad is from the same village my mom is from, and so there's a lot of unexpected commonality from there. He has this incredible pragmatism about how he builds things, thinks about things, siphons through problems, incredibly rational, very sensible. And so I felt with him this sense that, I'm often a very emotionally volatile person, lots of ideas. Probably my biggest flaw is a lack of focus, right? Lots of things juggling in the air at once. And really, I was looking for someone who would be able to take all that and be like, focus on this one thing. And when you focus on this one thing, here are the steps we'll go about doing this. And here's how we execute it. Here's how we get there. Right. And so there was this very natural pairing of him and I in terms of personality and what we cared about. Um, with Dan, he is like a big, big brain, right? So super, super smart. Was part of the team behind Gemini at DeepMind, was the lead author for Alpha Dev, did all these things. But also there was this sense that, every time I speak to him, he never speaks in jargon. He never tries to sort of impress you with a ton of knowledge. He explains everything in the simplest terms. And so when I speak to him, I'm like, wow, I feel like I just understood that, right? It's like having the best teacher you've ever had, right? And so you feel like you instantly understood it. And what's so interesting about him is that he has this childlike curiosity. It's every conversation with him, everything you mention, he starts going, wait, so why is that the case? Right? Can we dig deeper into that? And he starts, digging into it, and he gets to the sort of crux and the core of something. And so that sort of raw curiosity and that sort of niceness and emotional bubbliness that with which he does that is like incredibly endearing. Um, and so you have this super interesting trio between the three of us, where there's me who's very mission oriented, very in some ways like volatile, very sort of constantly ideas driven, lots of things thrown around the air, constantly trying to push and push and push with a lot of energy. And then you have, Soul going, hey guys, let's focus. Let's do this specific thing. Let's go one by one. Here's how we execute. And then you have Dan picking up on those ideas and going, here's how, like all the sort of experiments and iterations that we could do to find out like whether there are new things that we could do down the line. Right? And so you have the short and the long term, and you have the sort of like engine to keep pushing. And so it was this odd balance between the three of us that I don't think I'd ever experienced with any other team. And so when I met them, I was just like, maybe this is actually the right combination. So it's very interesting.
And how do you test your co founder relationship or work on it?
So I think to some extent, there's nothing that could test you more than just going through hard times together. Um, and I think we were actually quite lucky that despite the fact that, in many ways, the fundraise was very easy, like it took us around a month to close the deal from start to finish. And so it was very easy in that sense. But we also had these moments that validated in our minds that we weren't just doing this because Sequoia brought us together, for example. Because one of the biggest worries I had in my head was, Sequoia introduced all three of us to each other. Are they doing it because they think this is going to be a Sequoia backed company, right? It's like a guaranteed ticket where it's, you've got a Sequoia logo, you got everything, it's going to take off. Um, but instead, what happened here was, we had, um, within around 2 weeks or so of deciding to start this company together, uh, Sequoia were like, we want to observe for longer, right? We don't want to sort of lead your current round, right? Go look for other investors. We will support you in all kinds of other ways, but we don't want to lead it right now. And so suddenly we went from, Sequoia put us together, this is going to be a Sequoia back company, whoa, to just like, oh, shoot. Like, we haven't spoken to any other investor at this point. Like, literally, it's just a complete no-go. And I was asking them, hey, would you be open to bootstrapping this company with me for a year? Right? Would you just do it with me? Because I don't know whether we should raise venture capital, actually. We should really have a think about this. And instantaneously, they were like, yes, we want to do this. And they went back to their families and were just like, we're going to do this. Right. And so it was a very quick validation to me that actually they were serious. It wasn't just a Sequoia thing. It was something else. And then also, because we're so new to each other, we have to keep sort of communicating constantly on what we're building. And I think we've been through, already a few of these sort of, deep conversations about who we are as people, right? How do we build together? And so, literally yesterday morning, so I got separate phone calls on Monday night from each of my co-founders about, just like friction that they're feeling about how they're building the company. And so on Tuesday morning, I got them into a room and I was like, all right, we're going to be 100% transparent with each other. We're going to talk through these things and just figure out why this friction is happening. And at the beginning, both of them were like super smiley. It was like all sort of very diplomatic, right? So I realized that the only way I could get this to the resolution we needed was for me to basically just dig it continually until both of them were completely honest with each other, right? So everything that was framed as a working style difference that actually was underlying it a challenge of quality, right? So for example, you might say, hey, we have a slightly different working style in this way. But actually what you really mean is your work is not up to the standard I'm expecting. And when I push you, you're not giving me enough, in return, right? That's what you really mean. But then you could frame it all these other ways. And so I was just poking them, going, all right, what do you really mean by working style? What do you really mean by, this was not exactly what I expected, so on and so forth. Until we got to a point where it was a straight shootout of, oh, actually, I was expecting you to deliver this, and this didn't happen. Now, how do we figure that out? And surprisingly, once you have this sort of super direct conversation, it changes it completely. Because then you could start digging into, oh, why did that happen? Right? Why did we not manage to deliver what we said we would? And often it turns out to be these really subtle personality differences, right? So, what we worked out yesterday was, hey, one co-founder is a sort of very domineering character, and so when that co-founder sort of says something, I think we should do this, the other co-founder thinks, oh, they must really mean it, and that must be a super informed opinion. Maybe we should just do it. The other domineering co-founder then thinks, oh, does that mean that you have no idea what you want to do, and every time I'm the one in the driving seat, right? But actually, what's happening here is that underlying both is this expectation on one side that best decisions are made through conflict, that we should discuss and basically go through it and basically have a challenge on every decision. And the other is a consensus builder who's kind of going, we should try to agree. And so when you put them together, it gets this sort of strange dynamic that develops, right? And so in order to work through it, you have to first realize that this dynamic is happening, and for both of them to realize that dynamic is happening, and then to adjust how we go about it. And it means, yes, that sort of more beta founder basically, being much more open for the challenge, right? Being much more vocal about what they think. But it also means the domineering founder is sort of going a little bit back, right? And sort of going, hey, you can't frame things in absolute certainty, when actually it isn't a matter of certainty. And that then sort of gets us to much better discussions. And so, yeah, so really what we're trying to do there is to sort of suss out these underlying differences in a fundamental way, and then get us to much better conversations.
Where do you fall on the spectrum of consensus-based building to conflict-based building?
Hmm. So I was much, much more of a consensus builder in the early years. So I think everything from like 12 years old all the way to, let's say, 26, 27. I'm 29 right now. So all the way until midway through Mana, I was much more a consensus builder. And so I always wanted people to agree. And what I realized in Mana was you just can't do that. Like it's not going to work because um, if you wait for everyone to agree, you basically dilute the quality of what you're doing continually. Like you get this sort of constant dilution of the ideas that is being constructed. And especially in startups, it's much better to have a clean thesis that you test and that it fails, and then you test another thesis or iterate on that thesis and so on and so forth. But it's much worse when you have a clean thesis and then you try to consensus build and you dilute that thesis continually. And so you get to a point where that thesis is kind of fragmented and you have no idea what you're testing anymore, right? So, to give you a very specific example of something like this, we had a discussion, in the consumer education thing of, you know, do we basically build a, TikTok style consumer viral app that basically targets, instructors in areas that are completely non-academic? Or do we try to build a live learning platform that's much more focused on the K-12 academic market? And both of these are clean theses, right? So on one end, you have the sort of folks teaching you how to sow genes, and how to, water your plants and stuff like that. And it suits very much this consumer virality of like, hey, you first start on TikTok. So we aren't even going to build the sort of full TikTok interface, but you start on TikTok. You see these super interesting instructors, and you click into Mana to basically pay them for, additional packages tied to that thing. And necessarily means you'll get a lot of noise, right? You'll get people who are basically OnlyFans creators, but not quite, right? You'll get dancers, you get musicians, you get all these sort of super interesting creative arts, but it has nothing to do with formal learning. Or you would have this super curriculum tight learning platform that's tied to core learning, right? So these are very clean theses. But because we were consensus building, we ended up on somewhere right in the middle, which is this, we're going to build our own, TikTok style interface, but we're going to target formal learning, right? And we're going to try to get study tubers from YouTube to make short videos to teach you how to, do physics exams, right? And this just made no sense, right? Because in every level, it's not targeting the right customer. It's just at every level it was problematic, but it fulfilled the consensus of everyone in the group, right? Because there are some people going, we need that consumer virality to make this app work. And some people going, if you don't tie it to the curriculum, you don't learn well enough, and so on. So all these things. And so consensus building just wrecks these theses. And as a result, you're testing a middle ground thesis that's just bound to fail. And so I learned painfully from that actually consensus building is not always a good idea. And you have to be very, very definitive about what you're actually going to do, accepting that there will be sometimes sort of winners and losers in an argument, and you just have to pursue it and then let it play out. And so yeah, I think I've evolved over time on that.
How do you practically pursue and encourage conflicting conversations?
I think it's literally about essentially making it completely legitimate to, issue direct attacks like on an idea, right? So obviously not a direct attack on a person, like in the sense of you're a terrible person, you don't know what you're talking about, stuff like this. Like that obviously is a recipe for disaster. But very, very direct attacks on an idea to the order of, I think this is completely stupid for these three reasons, right? But always being very specific, right? So instead of going, I think this is dumb, and just stopping there, which is just a value or emotional judgment, being very specific about the reasons why you think it doesn't work. And then also testing whether whatever you end up with is something that is disagreeable. So, if you end up with a thesis that everyone would sort of broadly agree with, it's probably the wrong thesis, right? So if you have like a thing that kind of goes, we think that all humanity should learn better, which is kind of the Mana mission, right? Everyone would say, yeah, humanity should learn better, right? But that's not a disagreeable thesis. And therefore, you're not standing for anything. right? Because unless it's disagreeable, you haven't identified something that's core, that's different, that's fundamentally a breakthrough, right? And um, so it's the combination of the sort of you know saying, hey, everyone can attack this in a very specific way, and testing it at the end, kind of going, have we arrived at something that maybe half of the people will say is crazy or would disagree with it for some rational reason.
Is there a way that you routinize this and sort of bring it
Hmm.
into consistent practice?
I would love to say we do, but I actually think the honest answer is no. Um, I think it's actually like a way of being. Like this sounds ridiculous, but it's not a sort of, hey, in every meeting we do these things. It's a continual emotional journey of like everyone in the company getting comfortable with conflict. And so, and it's almost like even when you're you know picking something to do as a team activity, right? um it's better to basically have someone who says, I think we should do this, feel free to disagree, right? Like, let's go, right, and go at it, than it is to be like, what do you want, what do you want, what do you want, right? And everyone just going around and round and round in circles. um and it's quite subtle in that way, where every single mini decision in the company should be made with that sort of ethos of, we want to disagree, right? We think disagreement will get us to a better outcome, and we think that arriving at disagreeable outcomes is a good thing, right? And just being able to continually do that again and again and again. Um, and I don't think we have gotten there yet in any meaningful sense, right? Where we're still in the process of getting there. But I do feel it's not a framework necessarily that can be repeated as a mantra for meetings. It's more mentality.
Quick pause to say, if this show has brought you some clarity, then hit subscribe so you don't miss the next one, because one insight at the right time can change everything. Plus, it fuels the show so I can keep on showing up for you. Right, let's get back to the episode. When we last spoke, I asked you about the challenges that you were currently facing. This was early
Mm,
in the company's formation. This is before you raised, and you were talking about this challenge that you had, which is around hiring people,
mm,
and how in the past, when you had a problem, you hired someone to try and solve the problem. And now your mentality has shifted away from that.
mm.
Can you talk about your methodology as to when you plan to hire people and when you hold off from hiring?
So I think in general, the big lesson I learned from Mana was that when you raise, especially like quite a lot of money at pre-seed, um, you get in this really bad habit that when you have a problem, you think hiring someone is going to help you solve it. And what actually happens is, the moment your company moves beyond a single atomic unit, so probably at around the 5-person mark, where you start having to organize them to separate units and manage them separately, you start hitting effectively HR issues, right? So, how do we manage properly? How do we introduce new layers for management? How do we communicate across the company so that everyone's aligned? You basically slow yourself down continually with all these organizational problems. The worst thing is, because you need this additional layer to manage all these atomic units, the type of person who fits in these sort of managerial roles, but who are not founders, tend to also solve problems by hiring, right? Because they were usually in corporate environments or larger startup environments, where the way they measure the KPIs is, let's say in sales, it's like, well, each salesperson generates X amount of leads. And so if I hire 10 salespeople, I'll generate X amount of leads. And so if you give me a KPI, I will solve it with hiring, right? And so you have this absurd thing where it's not that you hire one or two people. It's actually each of those people then starts self-multiplying. And so you get into this giant problem where the company just gets more and more complicated without actually solving the core issues and moving fast. And so when we came to this company, I was like, okay, we've got to stick to the atomic units, right? We have to be really, really tight and move very fast as a small unit first, and then only hire when we really, really need to solve a sort of separate problem. And I think right now, the way we think about it, and this is still, a sort of gradually gurgitating concept, right? So we're not still 100% sure about it. Um, it's that if it's a problem that is time bound, so it's a problem that basically is something. So let's say you have underlying AI model and an AI pipeline that's been built out, but you need a web app to display it. And this web app will take 3 months to build. You have very clear scope, very clear requirements. Then that's basically a contractor job, right? So you just basically get someone short term, go do it. If you have a problem that is systematic in the company, that needs to be continually solved every day, but which doesn't involve a huge amount of creativity, right? It actually involves a sort of systematized process. So I would actually classify sales as part of that, for example. Um, then the best option is actually to create a fully automated solution, right? So by that I mean like you literally build out an entire sales pipeline that can be automated in any way and can be tweaked and fully transparent. And you can just work through all the sort of cold emails you're sending, the types of people you're targeting, the way you follow up, do all these things, because actually it's much easier to control an automated pipeline than it is a sort of whole team of people. And it's gotten to the point where a lot of these jobs that don't involve that much creativity can be done in this way. There's obviously still a class of sales that you cannot do in this way, which is basically the deep client relationships that you build at the sort of principal to principal level. But that to me, especially in the early stage of a company, that's a founder's job. It's not anyone else's job.
Can you give a couple of other examples of
Mm.
some parts of company building that you think are systematizable that don't require too much creativity?
Yeah. So customer support is a very obvious one right now. Um, it's it's a combination of the big problems should be solved by the founder directly, right? So if you have a really important client and they're facing tons of problems, the founder should be the one who's like diving straight into the problem to help solve that. And it's both more impressive to the client and also actually helps the sort of entrepreneur stay very focused on what the client's problems are. On the other end, there are a ton of much smaller issues that really should be, continually triaged and solved automatically. And you should get to the point where you basically don't need a human to deal with it, right? So, if I take a sort of giant startup example of this, which would be Uber, right? So, what Uber figured out is basically money can solve most of the problems that a customer is annoyed about. So, if your order is late or order is, not going somewhere, or your driver ate your order or stuff like this, the type of evidence is very consistent, right? So, like if your order broke, you just take a photo of that. So, the type of evidence is very consistent. The type of resolution is very consistent, which is like, we'll just pay you back or we'll refund you and so on. And so, you actually don't need a human to do that. And as a result, you can just click through the app and do that. So the solution there isn't even build an AI chatbot that can chat with you about your problems. It literally is a rules-based system that just like triages most of the most important problems and then leaves a very small selection of very unique problems for humans to solve. And I think that down the line for earlier stage companies is actually quite similar. That the founder should really be dealing with the most important customer support issues, and the rest try to automate as much as possible and try to triage as much as possible. Um, I would argue there are similar things you could do in like tax and legal, and expenses and stuff like this, but there are now just so many like options to do that. You don't have to build your own solution, right? So for expenses, you could literally just connect your Revolut account with Zero, and then just get all that automatically fed in. You could probably do a similar thing with some of the newer fintech like AI companies, like Puzzle, for example, that just generate all of your financials in different types of reports that are suitable for your investors. And so you could do all these things without having to spend founder time on it, just making manual reports and doing things step by step. So yeah, so basically that class of problems that are systematized, don't involve tons of creativity, should automate. So the only class of problem then that we should really hire someone for the long term is where you're literally trying to launch a new feature or even a new product like for the company, where you need a driving force to shape that area, right? And so in that, like, we actually haven't even found that yet for our company, right? So we're just going, the three of us can do almost everything that we need to do. But if we ever did hire someone long term, it would be that we're launching some fundamental new thing that it helps to have someone who's almost like a mini founder in their role. um, and the dream in my head of how the company would work is that you would just have essentially the core leadership team that's driving the overall vision of the company. The company has all these individual products that it provides. Each of these products has a mini founder effectively in charge of that product, but each of those products will be operated almost fully autonomously. And I think that's the closest I could imagine to a sort of truly post AI like way of running a company, where essentially AI can take all the mundane tasks, and humans are really the ones who are shaping the creative path for how to build something.
What has to change in startup mentality for that idealistic sort
Hmm.
of org structure to work?
So, my fairly controversial opinion is that most of the VCs in the landscape today were nurtured in an environment where uh, growth meant spending money, right? So, like for the last 30, 40 years, effectively, growing a company meant hiring a sales force, meant spending on ads, meant, having a sort of CAC LTV ratio and doing all these things. Um, and so the result is that the VCs, when you speak to them about fundraising, most of them would basically look at you and go, yeah, you should spend our money to like grow your company, right? And each dollar you put in would translate into X amount of revenue. You should grow it in this way. And the result is that the vast majority of startup advice in the whole landscape, in the whole ecosystem, is driven by these VCs who are saying, spend the money to grow and do all these things. And this is how you do it. And so you have this almost one-to-one correlation of salesperson equals to revenue, spend on ads equal to revenue, calculate the ratio, and then make the ratio better over time. And I think what needs to change is this idea that actually most of the fundraising is actually about accumulating enough credibility to get access, right? So it might be credibility to get access to customers. It might be as simple as getting credibility to get a ton of credits from AWS so that your backend costs go down. It might be credibility to hire great people because they need validation that your company makes sense. It might be credibility to go to the press to like spread out a consumer product and build virality. It might be building a network of people who you can call on to basically help you build a company better, right? The fundraise is not so much the capital, but actually the credibility. The capital gives you safety to experiment and iterate fast, but that actually any team should start off with the assumption that the company can be built autonomously and only hire when they need it. Now, that's a complete flip of how companies are built at the moment. But I think it's possible now. And the first set of companies that do this will be so remarkably profitable, so insanely cash flow positive, and so capital efficient because they don't have to raise that many rounds to make it work, and so scalable that once two or three of these companies exist, the entire investment landscape will shift and be like, we will only invest in these like autonomous companies and want everyone to do it this way. But we haven't got there yet, and everyone's still repeating the old playbooks. Um, and so, if anything's got to change, it's actually just a few companies have to prove that this is possible. And as a result, the investment landscape will react to that, and then that will change the whole narrative and the whole ecosystem.
Am I right in thinking that you raised your first round without an idea?
With Mana, so it wasn't quite without an idea, but it was quite close to that. So I was approached in SoftBank, and I was very burned out, right? So I was literally like, I want to get out of here ASAP. And at that point, I'd gone through the WeWork ordeal, which was already quite crazy. And then I was in ARM and helping them, and we did this thing where we spun off their IoT division, so all these things. And then at the very last minute, Masa was like, "Oh, I actually kind of want to sell ARM to Nvidia. We should bring the whole division back, right?" So, and at that point, we'd announced to the whole company that we're spinning off these divisions and we're bringing them back. So I was very broken. I just wanted to get out, and I got approached by this fund, and they were like, "Hey, do you want to build your own company? We will literally give you a term sheet on the spot, right?" And so it was like a 2 week process. Literally, we just from the first conversation to the term sheet, and um, before the second conversation, the first conversation was literally just about my background, and I had no solid idea that I wanted to build on at the time. And so it was just a sort of personal discussion. The second conversation, the night before, I was like, all right, I can't just go into an investment conversation with like no idea of what I want to build. So, and I'd been tracking, so I had this little journal where I sort of kept all these little ideas that I was thinking about all the time. And so I just picked like three of them and I said, okay, which of them looks most likely to be funded at this time, given my background? And the idea was a AI native consumer tutor bot, right, for K-12 students. And I had access to GPT-3 at the time, this is sort of mid 2020, late 2020, and so we were one of the first groups of people to have access to GPT-3. So I was like, maybe we could build a tutor bot with this. And so then that was how I sort of went into the conversation, and that like caught on to him. And in retrospect, all of this was crazy. None of this made any sense, right? Like, this was peak 2021, so VCs was just throwing money at founders. They were betting on me, yes, but I wasn't even sure this is a problem that I wanted to solve. I wasn't even sure whether this problem existed. I wasn't sure whether the solution was the right one. I wasn't sure who my customers were. Um, but then because I received investment on the basis of pitching this, I felt locked into this idea. I was like, all right, this is what we're going to do, right? And clearly it's a good idea. Otherwise, why would someone give us so much money for it, right? And so I started going about building this company and being very public about it, going all over LinkedIn, talking about it, all the way through. Um, and really, the more I did that, the more I locked myself into this idea. Because now your entire network knows that you're building this specific thing. And you can't just walk back on it and be like, oh, actually, this whole idea was stupid. We're going to do something else now. And so you just get really, really, misaligned incentives. And so in retrospect, you're exactly right. I raised sort of without an idea, like it was sort of with a rushed idea, got locked into it. And that was one of the fundamental reasons why we spent 2 years essentially spinning, trying to find a solution when it was probably from day one constructed in a fundamentally wrong way.
And so, what have you learned about starting a company with a balance of idea, team, investments? What's definitely crucial at the start, and what do you think is
Mm,
nice to have?
mm. So I think there's a few pretty important things. So the first is just always start a company and build a product based on your personal problems, right? So don't try to imagine all these sort of what humanity needs and what, this sort of top down vision and mission of, what you can build and affect change in society and so on. Actually, it's almost all the time about some personal problem you've experienced. And if you can construct a solution that solves your own problem, and there are sufficient people out there who share that problem, it will be a reasonably successful company. You at least will have customers. You'll be able to sort of sort that out. That's number one. Number two is to have the strength of personality to both reject investment when you're not ready and stay stealth until you're truly ready, right? Um, and in terms of rejecting investment, I think it's people will offer you money for all kinds of reasons, and it really has nothing to do with the fact that your idea is brilliant. Like the money is almost no indication of the fact that your idea will work because your investors have never talked to your customers, have some pattern recognition of what's failed in the past, and maybe some pattern recognition of what's worked. But the power curves are so acute that whatever worked in the past is probably not a good indication of the future. Whatever failed in the past is also not a good indication of what will fail again. And so that pattern recognition is not super helpful. And so your investors really know more than you do. And so you need to have the strength of personality to say, hey, thanks for offering me this much money and this is awesome. But I'm not ready for the money yet. We're still exploring. We're still trying to figure it out. And that's part of it. There's also the strength of personality to say, hey, you know, we don't know what we're doing yet. We have to just explore, talk to customers, iterate, build versions of the product to figure this thing out. And it's only when we've figured it out that we start going public. Because once you go public, all the effects of that lock-in get much, much stronger. Right? Because all the effects of lock-in are that, you start feeling like, I can't change this company anymore. I can't change a product. That there's all this social validation that starts hitting your head, and you get even more muffled in your decision making.
When thinking about this vision, this is the thing that generally doesn't change too much over time. And it's this foundational piece, which, if you get it right early on, the ripple effects are massive. And it's very difficult to have good clarity on it. So, how have you approached developing clarity and probably almost more importantly, simplicity
Mm,
with your vision now with Ethos?
mm. So I think the first thing we've done with this company is to just really drill down on me as a customer actually in the past, right? right? And literally every single aspect of what I did as a customer. And so we mapped out the whole customer journey from my personal perspective, and then went off and validated it with a bunch of other people who shared the problem. And so we got that sense that this is the customer journey. And then we actually started not by building, but by removing requirements. So we just went, okay, if we just approach this customer journey now with the available technology, what can we just take out from this completely, right? And just take out, take out, take out, take out. And then as a customer, what do I truly care about at that moment, right? What do I need and what do I not need? Cut, 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 cut. So you cut the requirements continually. And the product just becomes simpler and simpler and simpler and simpler. So we're building effectively, the first product is an automated expert network, right? And so you can basically describe in natural language the type of domain experts you're looking for, and it returns domain experts. And you can call them, and then we transcript the calls and we turn them into knowledge nuggets that you can use for due diligence. And what's interesting about this is the current process is incredibly complicated, right? So someone has this project they're doing for private equity due diligence. They describe the project in detail. They have to list out all their conflicts. They have to list out their timings. They have to do all these things, blah, 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 blah. And then they find a person and they get the sales associate to go out and spend 5 days looking for domain experts. They come back, they send you these bios with their full experience. You look at it, you choose, right? And then you have to email back and forth to schedule the calls and you do all these things. So, it's a mess. So at the beginning, our first version product was actually very much built in that image, right? So you have a form, you fill it in, and then you set it out, and then it returns with AI like who you're looking for. And then we realized actually it's as simple as one search bar, and you can just write like in natural language what you're looking for, right? So you could just say, hey, I'm looking for, uh, research scientists who know how to build foundational models for AI, right? Stuff like that. Or, people who have, bought GPUs from NVIDIA before, and stuff like this. And all of the complexity is hidden in the back, right? So we get, an LLM to start, deconstructing that natural language query into all these guesses of like, when you say foundational models, what does that actually mean? Okay, for foundational models, which are the biggest companies in the area? And then for those companies, what are the sort of job title hierarchies? And then which are the people, like which part of that hierarchy is most likely to know this question? So all the complexity is in the back. And all you know as a user is you've typed in this natural language query. 10 seconds later, bunch of profiles turn up, and it's exactly what you were looking for. And then at that point, the complexity comes back where you can start filtering them in all kinds of ways, right? So we give you tons of controls to go, oh, actually, I don't like these job titles. I want to change it. Or I want to add this other company and do all these things. But it's all hidden behind the simplicity of this process. And really, that could only happen from us mapping out the customer journey and just cutting out all the requirements until it's distilled down to a very simple thing. And then building the sort of simplest version of that and then testing it with users. Yeah, so that's how we build today.
And then the vision specifically is bottom up approach from that place of simplifying the problem down to its most basic form.
Yeah, so what's interesting about simplifying is that once a product is very simple, the way people use it becomes quite unpredictable. And it actually starts shining a light on what the vision could be. So, for example, when we built this search bar, our entire focus was on expert networks. So we're just like, we're going to build this thing for private equity and venture capital due diligence and all kinds of stuff like that. And then when we showed it to our friends, they didn't use it for, finding a domain expert. They're like, oh, I've been trying to look for a wedding planner. Can we try looking for a wedding planner in this thing? And then it's like, oh, I've been trying to look for an accountant who serves startups. Like, can we look for it in this thing? And so on and so forth. And suddenly we realized that this search bar and the pipeline we built in the back is so powerful that it can actually be used for all these other use cases. It can be used for sales, it can be used for hiring, it can be used for procuring services, and so on and so forth. We're not going to launch all those from day one. Right? From day one, we're still going to focus on expert networks as the first thing. But that actually gave us the idea for what the vision might be, which is that actually, the broader vision of the company is that all of the fundamental business functions in the economy boil down to the matching of people, companies, and products. Right? So, if you think about sales, it's basically matching, people with products, companies with products. If you think about, hiring, it's basically matching people with companies. If you think about investing, it's matching companies with another type of company, which is investors, right? And so on. And so, almost all of the sort of major business transactions are basically just matching of people, companies, and products. And that if you can build the best search engine for people, companies, and products, not in the sense of I already know which company I'm looking for, find me the company's information, but the sense of I'm looking for companies that have these characteristics, find me that. I'm looking for products that have these characteristics, find me that. I'm looking for people of these characteristics, find me that. That can then be lateralized across all of these use cases in many, many different ways. Um, and so our vision sort of organically emerged from simplifying the product and then seeing how people actually use it in a completely unexpected way to what we were thinking. So yeah.
We're coming into the end, and I had a brilliant conversation with your partner Cherie, who said some wonderful things about you. Actually, do you want to see them?
Sure. Yeah. She's never said wonderful things to my face, so yeah, here we go. Okay. Oh my god.
Yeah.
Okay. Oh, it's a video. Oh my god. Okay, cool.
What do you admire about him?
Um, I think how he helps a lot of people without really thinking about getting anything in return.
Hmm. Is there a time that
I think
stands
most
out?
of the time is like starting from little things, right? Uni students asking him for advice on, you know, career paths or anything. It might not be someone that he actually knows, right? But he's still spending time on it. Like I think most people who are working are probably more selective on who they're speaking to and like how much they can actually help, right? Whereas he probably goes a bit out of his way to help someone on maybe some introductions or whatsoever.
Or go on their podcast?
Yeah.
Like, what else do you think is really unique about him? What like makes him shine?
The determination, probably, like obviously this is a second startup, like of just wanting to make sure everything works, but at the same time, like wanting to make it work, but also at a very like humane kind of way. Like there are certain founders who are probably more like you can be cutthroat, but he probably still cares a lot about like anyone who's in a team, making sure that the dynamics work versus some founders I've seen who are probably more on if you don't deliver, you're gone, right? Like so
That
knowing the backstory of someone else is yeah.
that's amazing. I love that.
I think in general he's just like he's very observant of like how people are feeling. He makes sure that everyone's like, feels good about it, right? Like that. Yeah, I mean, I guess in a way he's just a mediator in a way to make sure that everyone's so comfortable where they are, like probably giving quite a lot of feedback so that the whole team could actually move forward.
That's really cute. She's never told me these things. It's very nice. Thank you. Thanks for showing me that.
One thing that she spoke about was this balance between empathy and care, but then also this sort of need to be ruthless and decisive as a founder. Those feel like opposing forces. How do you balance the two or think about them?
I don't think I've found a good balance of those things yet. I felt enormous amounts of guilt whenever we had to lay off people in Mana. Right? It was because I knew that these were direct results of my strategic miscalculations. Like it was a direct result of bad decisions I'd made, bad bets I made. Um, and we tried to be humane in the sense that, every conversation was where possible in person, right? So obviously, we were in remote at the time, so it was quite difficult to do everything in person, but it was definitely a one-to-one conversation every single time. It was always couched in what we really, really loved about that person and working with them. And then, why we had to sort of make these uncomfortable decisions. It was always couched in sort of great financial packages, even when we were struggling, right? So we paid everyone at least a sort of 3-month severance. We made sure we helped them find their next job. We made sure we made tons of recommendations. We would call them up after they've left just to figure out how they are. So we tried our best to make those things work, but ultimately these are people who bet their livelihoods on the company for essentially no return on the upside because they will have left, with basically shares that are worthless in some meaningful sense. Um, who are now entering uncertainty directly because of our mistakes. And so I look at that and go, as a founder, you can never really remove that guilt from what you've done. And I would hope that we never have to lay off people again in our new company, even though I know that's probably going to happen at some point in the lifetime of the company. And so in truth, I don't think I've found the right balance between those things yet. The only thing that we've tried to do is to go, how can we be, as supportive as we can in that transition? And one story I haven't told, that publicly before is that, one of the people that we laid off had a lot of, long-term mental health issues. And so he actually became a stalker of myself and some people on the team, right? So, and I don't think he ever really emotionally recovered from that process, right, of being laid off. And so, um, and he was, at some point arrested by police and all that, right? So really serious, situations. Um, and I looked at that situation and I thought, we hired that person because he came from a very, very challenging socioeconomic background, but was super, super smart. And we saw enormous amounts of potential in him. But we probably threw too big of a challenge at him. He was not ready for the role, and we just gave him this massive responsibility and just didn't make any sense. And when the company turned for the worse, we had to let him go. And I think, in many ways, we failed him, right? Like we could have done so much more to support him to go through this, path and sort of transition properly, but we just couldn't find the right construct inside a company to do it properly. So I think, what is underestimated properly because of the availability of venture capital, actually, I think, and the way VCs think about businesses too, because in the VCs perspective, their portfolios have winners and the losers don't matter and the winners all matter. And in some ways that translates into how they think about individual companies when it shouldn't, right? Because then in individual companies, they think, when it's good times, raise more money, right? When it's bad times, fire all the people and save costs, right? And it just goes around and around like this across the whole ecosystem. And it's almost become normalized for very young founders who are often quite inexperienced to raise tons of venture capital to build these visions with tons of money, fail, fire tons of people, and then try again, right? And then raise another round in 6 months and do it again, right? And in many ways, I've basically just gone through that transition again as well. And I look at this and go, this isn't healthy. Right? This isn't the right way that any of us should be building businesses. And maybe the age-old wisdom that my parents had is correct, which is that cash is king, right? Like in the end, it doesn't matter how much money you're raising. That's a privilege. That's interesting. But as a founder, never get yourself into a position where you're losing so much money that you have to fire people to get it working. Be sensible from day one, be disciplined from day one, and build, very purposefully, including in who you hire, so that you never have to make the reverse decision later down the line. So I hope I'll find the balance at some point, but I don't think I'm there yet.
It's a very powerful story, and I think lots of parts of that you could never have planned for or known. And so I'm sure there's some responsibility for you to take, but I think you seem like someone who takes extreme ownership, and that has its positives and negatives. But anyway, so I hope you're kind to yourself in that scenario. Lastly, just before we close up, what about when this translates to operating day to day with your co-founders? It's a lot clearer when it's having to fire someone, but there were Sol and Daniel. How do you balance this ruthless decisiveness, and then care and empathy and nurturing someone's emotional part side while also pushing forward
Mm,
diligently.
mm. Yeah, we have this strange ability to balance those dynamics between the three of us, where we would have this intense conversation about business, and then every day we would go out for a longer lunch together. Actually, so we would would eat it for a solid hour together, just chatting about everything that's not related to business, and we'll always pick like reasonably nice food so that we don't we don't feel like we're suffering through it. But we deliberately do this because all three of us love food, and it's just a way for us to get together and be happy. And we do this strange thing where every morning we see each other, we hug each other really tight, we ask each other about how our days are, we talk through all that, our families, everything, before we get into the stand up. And it's funny because the classics of stand up mantra is that you have to have really fast, efficient stand ups, right? Do it in 15 minutes, very fast. Everyone talks about it. But we deliberately make our stand ups fairly long, not because of efficiency or anything like that, but because we want to spend the time to really build a deep personal relationship with each other. um and the same thing goes when we leave every day and we hug each other very tight and we talk a few more things before we go. Um and so we have this strange ability to segregate the sort of really intense business decisions from the personal. And I think that's really helped us so far. I don't know whether this will last, right? I hope that this will. Like, I hope that 10 years down the line is exactly how we are. That's how we're trying to solve it today. And I do think that when people have some fundamental principle agreements, when they agree on what a humane sort of company should look like, when they agree on how to treat each other and how to treat other people outside of the company, that forms a foundation for a lot of other things. Um, and one final thing is, it's interesting, but I think one of the clearest ways I've found to sort of determine whether a co-founder or someone when you hire is a great person is by having a meal with them and then looking at how they treat the waiters. And it's just so telling because you have this weird dynamic where they maybe want to please you or want to look at their best. But the moment they're facing the waiter, the waitress, the waiting staff, everyone, they are, there's this power dynamic that shifts. And, they are showing some parts of their authentic self. Um, and almost always, and in the case of Dan and Sol, what's interesting is that we've built really good relationships with the restaurants we work in, like the restaurants that we go to. And we know like almost all the staff at the places we go to almost every day. And that was one of the ways I figured, yeah, these are probably the right people. And we could build this long term.
The way to test is
Yeah.
tried and tested. I love it. We have a closing tradition,
Mhm.
which is, given that you have been so kind and generous enough to come and share your experiences and your wisdom with me, I'd love to find a way to pay it back, but more so in a way that outlasts this conversation and hopefully can ripple off into the future. And so, is there something that you could use support or help with that an audience of entrepreneurs and aspiring entrepreneurs could support you with?
I think it's actually in the end a very simple one, which is anyone who's been through the ups and downs of being a founder, of the toughest parts, the nearly run out of money parts, and the best parts, um, would love to be friends and love to hear your stories. How you've gone about doing it, how you've navigated all of it, because in the end, I think I don't know whether this is the last company I will ever found, the first of many, or like I don't know, right? But I do know that this is going to be tough and it's going to be hard all the way through. And the only remedy I've ever felt is talking to other founders and understanding how they've experienced all that. So yeah, so just friends. It sounds great.
Well, however hard the journey might be going forward, I know that you will navigate it with a lot of care, thoughtfulness, kindness, and focused work to solve real problems. So I'm so excited for your future and excited to follow it. And thank you so much for coming and sharing. It's been very real and very insightful.
Thank you so much, AJ.